Hi. Hi, good evening and welcome to this side event of the Asia Clean Energy Forum 2022. The subject of this event is Southeast Asia's power grid, a conduit for low carbon Southeast Asia. I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers. My name is John Cotton and I'm the Senior Programme Manager for the Energy Transition Partnership, and I will be the moderator for this evening. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Asia Clean Energy Forum for having us here tonight and for all the organising. I extend my wholehearted thanks and appreciation to our panelists, and of course, thank you to all of those who are joining online for this event. So I'll skip straight to the agenda, and please also be informed that this side event is being recorded. Could you share the agenda, please, John? So very shortly, I'll give a welcome speech to give background information on this. We'll have a keynote on the ASEAN Power Grids development from Dr. Twarat Sutabud, who is the Chief Inspector General of the Ministry of Energy Thailand and the ex-chairman of the ASEAN Power Grid Consultative Committee, the APGCCC. Following this, we will hear from our panelists who will each be giving a presentation. We'll have Mr. Benny Soyadi, the Manager of Power, Fossil Fuel, Alternative Energy and Storage from the ASEAN Centre for Energy, aka ACE. We'll hear from Ms. Tarinya Supasa, the Project Lead Energy Policy for Southeast Asia Clean, Affordable, Secure Energy, or CASE, and also Agora Energy Wend. We'll hear from Mr. Matthew Wittenstein, the Chief of Section Energy Connectivity at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP. We'll hear from Dr. Michael L. Boyd, the Senior Energy Advisor at USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia, or the IDMA. And we'll hear from Dr. Pablo Javier Koch, the Energy Analyst from the IEA, or the International Energy Agency. Following these presentations, we'll have a roundtable discussion where we hope for some lively chat on the theme of tonight's event. So I'd like to now give the welcome introduction. So unfortunately, my director, the Director of Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, Ms. Serva Yavanpa, cannot be with us tonight. She's actually on a flight to Bonn, where she's joining the COP27 preparations. But she has prepared an introduction. And I see Serpa has made it. That's great, Serpa. Just in the nick of time. So Serpa is probably sat in an airport somewhere, but it's great. Over to you, Serpa.
Just give me one moment, please. Hi, John.
We're delighted you could make it, Serpa. We know you've just dashed from a plane to get in situ.
So thank you. Yes, I'm at the airport, but welcome to everyone. And I really am looking forward to, John, this forthcoming seminar on the ASEAN Power Grid. It's really indeed our pleasure at the Southeast Asian Energy Transition Partnership to bring together a distinguished panel like this of experts to launch a discussion into this topic here in the region. So welcome to our distinguished panelists and everyone joining in. So let me just say a few words about the Southeast Asian Energy Transition Partnership and how we think we can contribute to collaboration on the ASEAN Power Grid as a conduit to low carbon future in the region. ETP, as many of you know, is a unique consortium that brings together the governments of France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada, and the philanthropies of Children's Investment Fund Foundation, IKEA Fund, Sequoia Climate Fund, and many other philanthropies operating under the UN umbrella. As a collaborative platform itself, ETP brings convening power to make bolder efforts at enabling energy transition in the region. Energy transition presents complex goals with implications that permeate throughout the economy and societies in Southeast Asia that call for deployment of the best practices in collaboration. And secure and reliable grid infrastructure is certainly one of those complex issues and a key to facilitating Southeast Asia energy transition and attainment of the net zero emissions in the energy sector, the NDCs, and all the other climate goals, including the region's goal of 23% of renewable energy by 2025, just 3 years from now. The grid is also probably the most important barrier to enabling these targets to become reality. The Association of the Southeast Asian Nations introduced ASEAN Power Grid in the 80s to enhance regional energy security and sustainability. With the ambitious dream of integrating regional power system, ASEAN Power Grid will help meet the region's rising demand for energy, improve access to energy services, and reduce the costs of developing an energy infrastructure. The ASEAN Power Grid also establishes demand for renewable energy, as funding for fossil energy sources, particularly coal, is tapering off, and as carbon counting becomes a critical element in international power trade agreements, the surplus demand will be met by the surplus renewable energy supply through an interconnected power system. However, the ASEAN Power Grid is also a complex project and involves many stakeholder groups, ranging from the governments and the various agencies, sub-sovereign institutions, such as the provincial and district and municipal administrations, and the business sector, among many others. So let me now turn to that key question: why is ETP here? How can the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership add value to ASEAN Power Grid project as a pathway to low carbon economies in Southeast Asia? Firstly, by enhancing collaboration. Since the mid-80s, the APG, or the ASEAN Power Grid project, has been receiving support from various partners. ETP can help sustain the development partners' interest in the project and help fill diagnostic gaps and capacity building needs that still may impede progress, to moving from the study stage to implementation and construction of the connections, establishing of the market mechanisms, and harmonizing grid codes. ETP can support progressive decision-making and getting through the challenges to ensure that the partnership involving ASEAN, the ASEAN Secretariat, the ASEAN Center for Energy, and the bilateral and multilateral, the UN and the private sector partners in the project to put their best efforts forward toward the shared objective of seeing the interconnected power system work and running and helping the region capitalize on its renewable energy resources. So at ETP, we are considering an opportunity to assist with the ASEAN Power Grid project in multiple ways, with the focus on a dynamic and results-oriented partnership. And we also know that many in the audience today, and certainly all among our prestigious panelists today, are keen to see this project in its fruition, to come to its fruition. So this will be an exciting event. I am very much looking forward to it. So without further delay, John, let me hand it back to you. I suppose you will introduce now our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Serpa, and we're delighted that you could make it between your flights. You framed really well today's event and really highlighted the importance of the ASEAN Power Grid and the exciting role for the stakeholders to play in it. So now please let me introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Twarat Sutabat. Dr. Twarat is the Chief Inspector General of the Ministry of Energy Thailand and the ex-chairman of the ASEAN Power Grid Consultative Committee. Dr. Twarat currently holds the position of Chief Inspector General. He is also a member of the governing board of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, REAP, as well as an advisor in the advisory panel of Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, for which we are very grateful. Dr. Twarat has experience in a wide range of energy policy coordination and initiatives, such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, and international energy cooperation. His other current positions include Board of Directors of PTT Exploration and Production Public Company Limited, or PTTEP, or Portator, and National Security and Dual Use Technology Centre. Prior to his current role, Dr. Twarat served as the chairman of the ASEAN Power Grid Consultative Committee and the Director General of Energy Policy and Planning Office, EPPO. Dr. Twarat holds PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, USA, and a Masters of Geotechnical Engineering. So, with that said, that's quite an impressive CV. Please, over to you, Dr. Twarat.
ขอบคุณครับคุณ John, for your nice introductions. And first of all, I would like to thank Asia Clean Energy Forum and also the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, especially SERPA, for inviting me to join this very important meeting. And I have a presentation to present to you. And I would love to see the conversations after these presentations and the dialogue that we could have. Next slide, please. However, my presentation, it would be very short and concise. I have 5-point presentation for you, a brief introductions, and also some overview of ASEAN power sector. And I will spend some time on the progress and challenges of the ASEAN power grids and its development plan. And I also will give some of my take on what APG would need to move forward and some key takeaway from my presentations. Next slide, please. So, well, it is very obvious that every country in this planet has a plan to become, carbon neutral, or to become less dependent on fossil fuels. Many countries, more than half of the GDP of this planet, already commit itself to become carbon neutral by 2060 or 2050. And also, so does the ASEAN, Southeast 10 ASEAN member countries. Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand already have a plan and some commitment to make sure that renewable energy will progressively enter into our fuel mix and probably taking over fossil fuel in the next decades. However, as the introduction by Serpa is very clear that we need infrastructure to support this. And that infrastructure is the ASEAN power grid that we have talked about, and we have sit on the table and made a plan for many, many years. But what I plan to discuss with you today is what does it take to move it forward and forward quickly. Next slide, please. And as you may know, that ASEAN is one of the regions that is lucky enough to have a good endowments of fossil fuels, including coal and natural gas. So for the past 20 years, the surplus or the increasing demand of power is mainly met by the supply of the fossil in the region, including coal and natural gas. But this changed dramatically when COVID hit. When COVID hit back in 2020 and 2021, it evaporates all the demand of the power in the region. So some of the country, including Thailand, has left over with many stranded power plant and stranded contract on fossil fuels. And that become one of the barriers for renewable energy to get into the system. Next slide, please. So I would like to give some overview of the power sector in ASEAN. And I just make one brief comment that we have a lot of rooms to do decarbonizations, but we need to stay together and we need a lot of push on this. Next slide, please. As I mentioned to you that ASEAN has a good endowment of fossil fuels. So about 60-65% of our fuel mix currently come from fossil fuel, including 31% from coal and another 31% from gas. The rest come from another types of renewable energies. 21% from hydropower, mainly from a few countries, such as the neighboring countries of Thailand, such as Laos, PDR. And also the solar and wind becomes advancing progressively in the past few years, especially in Vietnam and Thailand. And also ASEAN has a good plan and a good visions to increase our fuel mix, our renewable energy into the fuel mix, that we would like to have at least 23% of renewable energy mix in our total primary energy supply by 2025. As of 2019, a few years ago, the progress is about 14%. Next slide, please. So we have a plan called APAEC, or ASEAN Plan of Action on Energy Cooperation, in which is stated clearly that APAEC needs a connectivity and market integrations. So the two keywords needs connectivity in terms of infrastructure connectivity, and also we need a market integration and also system operating integration to make sure that the market mechanism can work over that infrastructure. And ASEAN is lucky enough that we have this plan and vision for a long time. So we have a good endowments of local knowledge and expertise among our good friends from all 10 countries. And we have also the institutions called HAPUA, in which is the head of the electricity utility of the 10 member country that send a representative to talk over and make a plan of the connectivity and the market integration. Next slide, please. And the plan always look like this. There's a list of connections that we wish that it would come online or it would come into reality. Right now we have more than 16 or 18 already interconnected between mainland ASEAN and also within Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia. We hope that the interconnection can be ongoing and be enforced and reinforced through the country that has more potential, both on the supply potential and the demand potential, such as the Philippines and Borneo Island, in which 3 countries share 1 island, and also Myanmar. Next slide, please. And also the endowment of our renewable energy resources. We are lucky enough to have plenty of hydropower, in which have been seen as one of the cheapest renewable energy supply in the region. We have a good endowment on solar and wind, and solar have a trend of price of downward trend. However, the wind installations in Southeast Asia, the price seems to be going up. And also we have a good potential of biomass and biogases in the regions. So after all, I think ASEAN has a good supply. We have a potential of enough supply to supply all of the demand in the country. However, we need infrastructure. As many of you know that in the past year, there are a few incidents that happened, including many curtailments in Vietnam for renewable energy project. But countries such as Singapore is hungry for renewable energy. They are looking for it, but there is no one to supply it for them. So we need such an infrastructure and the market mechanism to make sure that the surplus supply in Vietnam can go all the way to the big markets such as Singapore. Next slide, please. And also at the beginning of ASEAN Power Grids, we start by doing bilateral connections, bilateral agreements between countries. Thailand as example, we have a good bilateral connectivity with our neighboring countries such as Laos, PDR, and Malaysia. And we also have some low voltage connection with Cambodia and Myanmar. And we hope that this could become a backbone of ASEAN Power Grid, at least in the mainland ASEAN in the next few years. Next slide, please. However, there are some stagnations and a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. And I would like to take a few minutes to highlight the progress and some challenges on the development of the past few years on ASEAN Power Grid. Next slide, please. As I mentioned to you that we have a lot of supply potential. And in the past few years, a lot of renewable energy projects popping up in Vietnam. And somehow the rules and regulation in Vietnam is still mainly consuming domestically. But if somehow the arrangement can be made that the surplus supply from Vietnam can go through Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and go to Singapore, the demand in Singapore can be met from the renewable energy in the regions. So this is purely connecting supply to demand exercise. And we need the grid, we need the markets. Next slide, please. And also you may see that the renewable energy, cost of renewable energy is decreasing, especially solar power. And probably, hopefully, the wind power and biomass power could be also decreasing in the soon future once we get the economy of scale. However, in some systems, such as Thailand, even though the technology seems to get cheaper, but the actual cost might not be, because as I mentioned, there are some stranded assets, and the stranded cost of some fossil fuel power plant that embedded in the system, that making renewable energy a little bit more expensive than it's supposed to be to get into the grid. So some of this issue need to be worked out to make sure that the stranded asset is not a barrier of entry of the new power in the future. Next slide, please. And the plan of ASEAN Power Grid, as I mentioned to you, we have a good short-term plan on bilateral connections. But however, the long-term plan of making ASEAN Power Grid or APG commercialized or operational wise is still very vague. We're still not seeing the light of the day that we can operate the multilateral trade among ASEAN members. Right now, it's only bilateral. We have one pilot project called LTM, which stands for Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia, that transmit the electron of electricity from Laos to Malaysia via Thailand. But the extension of this project to Singapore gets snagged due to some legal issues. So I hope that, you know, in terms of planning, we should all ASEAN member countries should spare their heads and, you know, make a bold statement that the APG can be commercialized or can be in operation within 3 or 5 years, and then, you know, make a focus on how to make it work. Next slide, please. Recently, there are many universities. There's one that I know of, has reanalyzed the ASEAN power system, because in the past few years, more renewable energy asset has been popping up in Vietnam, and the power system need to be reanalyzed. And I do see a potential that Vietnam can become a renewable energy powerhouse in the future. But the way to connect this supply to the major markets such as Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore, and maybe all the way to Jakarta, it needs some investment, and it needs some institutions to make sure that rules of the market could work to bring the electron to the market. Next slide, please. The university that I have been helping has do some power system analysis and also try to reanalyze to make sure that the new system or the new scenario of Vietnam can be taken into account. And I hope that the ASEAN Center of Energy, or ACE, can take this forward, because things that happen in Vietnam already changed some landscapes in ASEAN. Next slide, please. But when it comes to the multilateral trade model, I think we haven't gone that far yet. I think the model of trading is still very much on the secondary trading. That would mean one country trade to another country, and then that country would, distribute the power within their own country. And if there is some excess capacity, it can trade to the third country. But we hope that this ASEAN power grid market mechanism can be similar to the one in continental Europe, in which the primary trading of multilateral trade can be fully integrated into the system. And I hope that this type of model can be worked out in terms of rules and regulations and the commercialization size of the operations. Next slide, please.
Okay, last minute, please.
Yeah, this is my last slide, and I will conclude it. That what is the APG need to move forward? Next slide, please. The APG need three things. They need some political will, including some agreements on some of the key locations, such as interconnections and the locations of the market operator, some common language on the operation. And also the second, APG will need some technical factor, and I think this technical factor is the least difficult one. The most difficult one, probably the political one. On the technical factor, the grid code, third-party access, billing charge, data sharing, especially on the congested transmission capacity, is need to be shared, and need rules and regulation to make sure that the information is kept to those relevant to the data. Last but not least, ASEAN Power Grid need institutional factor. We need a central clearinghouse, and we also need a process to processing the dispute resolution mechanism. And I think if this three factor can be resolved in the next 3 to 5 years, then the dream to see ASEAN Power Grid into the operational world could become reality. Next slide, please. And that would conclude my presentation, because I already spent 15 minutes, and the key takeaway is this. First, ASEAN is ready for energy transition, and we have lots of rooms to decarbonize it. ASEAN Power Grid is obviously a key factor, is a key infrastructure to accelerate the decarbonization process in ASEAN. And ASEAN is lucky enough to have good endorsement of cost-effective fuels for power generations. ASEAN is good and lucky enough to have fundamentals, especially legal and technical part of it, on the bilateral power purchasing agreement. I hope that it could become a fundamental for the multilateral power purchasing agreement. And also, ASEAN has a good action plan on APA, but we need some political will on the long-term process. However, the long-term plan is still vague, and is still no conclusion on the institutions to drive the multilateral trade, multilateral power trade agenda. And in my opinion, it's not enough push from the top. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. I will stay around if there is any questions. Thank you ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you very much, Dr. Twarat. That was fascinating. That was a really, really interesting presentation. You really got to the heart of the question. What does it take to move the APG forward and move it forward quickly? This is an important part, and I really take away that your point that decarbonisation, we need to work together. Thank you very much for your time. It's highly appreciated. So the next part now, we enter a section called the Asean Power Grid Strategic Plan and the supporting initiatives. So we'll hear from individuals who are paramount to the success and driving the interconnectivity of the region forward. First, I would like to welcome and introduce Pak Benny Soyadi. Pak Benny Soyadi is manager of the Power Fossil Fuels Alternative Energy and Energy Storage Department at the ASEAN Centre for Energy, or ACE, which is an intergovernmental organization within the ASEAN structure representing the 10 ASEAN member states' interests in the energy sector. Pak Benny is an energy professional with 12 plus years of experience managing programs and conducting research on energy and climate change. He's currently leading ASEAN's energy projects with the US, China, India, Norway, and international development agencies, overseeing over $10 million in project portfolios, including the ASEAN Energy and Climate Change Project, ACEF. So without further ado, please, Pak Benny, you're a very pivotal person in the discussion today, so it will be great to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. But I think not only success, maybe it's the slow progress is also partly because the work that I'm doing at the ASEAN Center for Energy. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to all of you based in Southeast Asia, and today to all others who are joining live with us today. And thank you very much for the ETP for inviting me to join the discussion on the ASEAN Power Grid, a flagship regional infrastructure project that was initiated more than 30 years ago. I have two slides, just partially also recalling what's mentioned by Dr. Twarat before, as the ASEAN has long pursued the realization of the ASEAN Power Grid, promoting the power interconnection and trade and increasing transmission capacity of interconnection among and between the countries in this region. As we mentioned earlier, also by Sherpa, I mean, the initiative is cemented since the signing of the agreement in 1986. So it's quite a while now, but the leaders acknowledge that the energy connectivity through the establishment of this ASEAN Power Grid have been an important issue that ASEAN must address, especially given the growing demand for the energy in the region today and the aspiration to collectively move toward the energy transition. In view of the complexity, asking 10 countries to sit down and have a common agreement is in fact very challenging us, but as we know, the ultimate aims is to construct the regional power interconnection, beginning with the cross-border bilateral term and gradually expanding to the sub-regional term, and over the time to achieve a completely integrated ASEAN power grid that me and Dr. Twarat and all of us is envisioning can be seen in the near future. But this is the progress that we have, excluding the direct point-to-point interconnection, like what is being shown earlier. Today is around 7,700 megawatt interconnection, and also there is around 500 megawatt in final construction expected to be COD by this year. So is the progress that we have here in the region. Next slide, please. In this slide 2. The work on the ASEAN Power Grid is actually the origin of the master plan studies lies in the pursuit of realization of this ASEAN Power Grid. Collectively, we 10 countries in this region, policymakers, utility people, and regulatory body, that we work on the development of of a document called the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan Studies. And we realized that these AIM studies reveal the need to focus on the inter-country cooperation in the power sectors to support the greater ambition for having renewable energy in the region. Particularly now we have a specific target to support, to achieve the 23% of renewable energy in ASEAN energy mix by 2025. And not saying impossible, but it's difficult for the region to achieve it without a collaboration through the cross-border power interconnection. We also see that there is an urgent need to explore the opportunities and benefit of having higher renewable energy, variable renewable energy, and follow the emergence of new and more sustainable technology with lower costs that could facilitate the multilateral power trade. So this is an ongoing discussion that we have currently with the countries on the firm existing and the possibility to expand the capacity, and also on the discussion between the countries to build the proposed capacity to eventually build up this interconnection between the countries. And all of this is being designed through the document that I mentioned, the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan Study. Version 3 is just complete with the support of the USAID program. Earlier, we'll also benefit from the expert from various global institutions such as NREL, IEA, RENA, and Hawaii National Energy Institute, and others, many global experts. Through this new map that we aim to enhance connectivity in this region, and where we can see the power system connectivity to increase the power system flexibility through effective utilization and resource sharing across the geographical location for the common regional benefit. Which common regional benefit can be interpreted in many ways, because we also see that how the country react on how this power grid, the ASEAN power grid, will support their national interest to achieve the energy transition. As mentioned earlier, where a number of countries highlighting more their ambition with this ASEAN power grid. There's still a long way to go before it can be fully established, but we are not biased to say we have a good progress can be seen, but the involvement from everyone is definitely key to accelerate this movement. I stop here, but happy to have a follow-up discussion on this important topic, and back to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Benny. Thank you for sharing that information with us. That was very insightful. We really appreciate the difficult tasks that lay ahead, but also the huge potential that also lays there. And we're very confident you'll drive it in the right direction. Next, I'd like to go to Turinya Supasa. Turinya Supasa, PhD, is a project lead energy policy for Southeast Asia Clean, Affordable, Secure Energy, or CASE, which is a aligned program with ETP. And also she's from Agora Energy Wind. With CASE, she's developing evidence-based and practical strategies to encourage a productive exchange of ideas among stakeholders to advance the energy transition towards decarbonisation in Southeast Asia. Among many other accolades, Turinya was the chief editor and lead modeler of the 6th ASEAN Energy Outlook, the flagship study to examine the renewable and energy intensity targets set in the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, or APEC. Phase 2, 2021 to 2025. I'm very interested to hear from Turinya today and her activities relating to the subject. Please, Dr. Turinya, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Yeah, so as for the great introduction from myself, again, so I'm Turinya from Agora, and also we are working in CASE project. So CASE stands for Clean, Affordable, and Secure Energy Systems. So we have the mandate mainly in the 4 ASEAN countries, and like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. and also in regional level. I think in case the main mandate is to support the decarbonizations or enhancing the decarbonizations of energy system in Southeast Asia. And yeah, today would like to take a chance to contributions in the discussion of the APG or the ASEAN power grids. So with the political backup and sufficient investment, capital and network integration can help optimizing the energy system in the regions. And from CASE and Agora perspective, we think we should ensure that this APG can fully utilize the speed up of shift towards renewable energy based power system in the regions. And today we'd like to add some high level considerations to discuss to the end. So next slide, please. Yeah, so in many cases, like the cross-border power system integrations is found positive and able to bring the benefits like lowering the power system cost, increasing security, like, increasing the diversity of resource and lower the environmental impact. However, there also the risk that the integration network could induce somehow the environmental challenge if it's not well designed. So the integrated network on their own do not deliver low carbon energy system. They benefit those technology with the lowest marginal cost. So the emissions reduction from integrated system can be gained only if the system is designed to utilize more renewable energy resource rather than the fossil fuel based generations. So there are several conditions that shall be met. So the first one is the policy incentive for the low carbon energy. The policy instruments for the low carbon energy mix. This means like expanding renewable energy conjunctions with phasing out fossil. For example, the carbon price and the coal phase out. In multilateral trade can result in increase the coal-fired generations due to the lower operation cost. But that will not happen if the CO2 price and the coal phase out or the externality is included. And then the harmonized policy framework is a key. And in interconnect systems, so restriction target in one country may lead to carbon intensive electricity consumption in the other. For example, like if one country have more stringent target in in the carbon or mitigation target, but the others not, then it could happen in considering the leakage risks between the cross-border system. The second one is about the market design matter. So the cross-border interconnection is the key flexibility resource that facilitate renewable energy integrated and can reduce the curtailments of the variable renewable energy generations. But the effective cross-border market with short-term trades enable variable renewable energy to participate. For example, right, real-time operations or the real-time dispatch is important. However, like to avoid, the long-term cross-border physical, like the power purchase agreements will generally not support the integrations of the VRES. And the last one is about the energy system assessment and planning to ensure the complementary of the renewable energy production patterns across border. So the interconnections cross border is smoothen the effects are typically found for the hydro and wind power. But what about the interconnect system where the solar PV is to become the dominant technology source like in Southeast Asia? So the solar intensity across Southeast Asia geographic area is quite similar across country. In this case, so balancing needs maybe more prevalence on the subnational and regional level. So we should therefore access the system value of the cross-border capacity additions versus decentralized solution, for example, like solar and battery. So next slide, please. So you will see in this figure for Europe, so winds become less volatile at a higher level of aggregations, and the effects enabled by networking integrations across country, like in Germany and the other country. And the potential for such smoothing effect is a condition of integrating VRES to the cross-border trade. So in parallels to network integrations, there are other avenues for maxing system flexibility, whereby the integrations of VRES, which should not lose sight and should pursue in parallel to advancing the ASEAN's power grid as well. For example, like change the operation of conventional power plants to provide a flexibility service. And the storage technology, which also should be considered. And the last one is about the demand response management and the sector couplings. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the last slide. And the APG can help deliver the renewable energy-based power sector transitions, and complementary action is needed in the realms, the energy policy, energy system reform, and the plannings. So this will require that cooperations among the different stakeholders in Southeast Asia and be intensified further. So policymakers should therefore keep in mind the following points. So the first one, it's focusing on the increase the coordination and harmonizations of the energy policy amongst the multiple jurisdictions should be considered. The second one is about the governance and institutions. Yeah, so in the interconnect system, the capacity addition across the border may affect domestic producer cash flow. And then the regional system planning can help alleviating such concerns. So in this exhibition, the requisite the regional agency takes time, but it be initiated as well to aid the infrastructure expansion. And lastly, the market and the system reform, it's one of the concern. Maybe could be something that could start today, but because for these regional, like the APG, is considered as a secondary regional trade for absorbing the surplus electricity, which could link system in different market structure and decisions. So yeah, in long run, should be the market regulations will be increased and needs to be harmonized across different jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I think that's all from my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuntrinya. You did a great job there of fitting so much information into 7 minutes. That's very impressive. You managed to get into the technicalities and the challenges there, but kept it very succinct and offering some great takeaways. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you later in the discussion panel. Next up, we have Matthew Wittenstein. Matthew Wittenstein is the Chief of Section for Energy Connectivity at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UNESCAP. In his role, Matthew supports member states in their efforts to improve the sustainability and security of energy systems through increased cross-border power systems integration. Recent work includes capacity building for energy regulators and utilities in Southeast Asia, an assessment of the potential to develop a green power corridor in Northeast Asia, and supporting increased cooperation on sustainable energy among the countries of the Pacific. Prior to joining the UN, Matthew is a senior electricity analyst at the IEA, where he focused on the economics of generation, the challenges of encouraging investment in clean energy technologies, and electricity market design. From 2011 to 2014, he was a fellow at the US Department of Energy. Matthew holds a Masters of International Affairs from Columbia University with a concentration in international economic policy. So with that, very pleased to announce, Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction. I'll just wait for my slides to come up. We can go straight to the next slide, perfect. Just to start, first, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a really excellent discussion so far. From United Nations ESCAP perspective, we see energy connectivity, especially in the power sector, as a critical tool for enabling the energy transition. And I want to talk a little bit about how we see the potential to accelerate sustainable connectivity in Southeast Asia. But first, let me start by just noting the way in which we at ESCAP work on this topic. We generally approach it from one of three angles. One is through capacity building. As was mentioned, we're trying to do trainings for regulators, for utilities, for the relevant stakeholders in our member states. We do analytical work, publish papers, and we bring stakeholders together to have them have conversations that allow them to collaborate more effectively among themselves at the sub-regional and also at the regional levels. Next slide, please. just to say that the importance of energy connectivity for our member states is I think really clear, in particular through the endorsement of the regional roadmap on power system connectivity, which was endorsed in 2021 by our member states. The regional roadmap is the document that guides our work on power system connectivity, and it contains a vision, a set of principles, and 9 strategies for enabling sustainable power system connectivity across Asia and the Pacific. So just to say, we work broadly among a wide variety of member states, and this document really is an attempt to show how energy connectivity can bring benefits to a great diversity of countries. And then you do that through strategies that cover areas like planning, financing and development of cross-border infrastructure, operational issues, such as moving towards multilateral power trading and coordinating operations, and then a number of cross-cutting issues, which in many ways are the most fundamental of these. So building trust and political consensus. We already heard about the importance of political will. Developing intergovernmental agreements to guide the process. Coordinating, harmonizing, and institutionalizing policy and regulatory frameworks, again, has already been raised. Building capacity, a big part of our job. And really critically ensuring the coherence of connectivity with sustainable development goals. That one in particular is important because, as you already heard in the previous presentation, connectivity by itself does not guarantee sustainable development. It is just a tool. It is a platform on which countries can trade electricity or utilize resources far from their borders. These resources don't have to be sustainable. They don't have to be renewable. They don't have to be green, but we want to make sure that they are. We see connectivity as a tool for enabling transition, but only if it is supportive of and consistent with the development of, for example, renewable energy resources. Next slide, please. So how are we doing that in particular? Well, first, what I should say is we are working with our member states to implement all 9 of these strategies. But the one I wanted to highlight in particular is a project that we're working on to develop what we're calling a framework for green power corridors, which are our vision for sustainable power system connectivity. A green power corridor is essentially an integrated power system across multiple countries or multiple jurisdictions, so it could be even within a country, that meets 3 main criteria. First, as I already said, it must support sustainable development. So this is in particular, in our view, aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 7, access to modern renewable energy. So this means we want to see it increase the deployment and integration of renewable energy, but also increase access to modern energy sources. So utilizing connectivity as a tool for bringing power to underserved communities or improving the quality of power to communities that currently don't have it 24/7, or if they do, not of the high enough quality to utilize effectively. And of course, just more broadly, it must serve the decarbonization and climate change mitigation agenda. So it doesn't have to be renewable energy, but it must be in the direction of lower carbon emissions. Otherwise, it's just not a sustainable project. Second, it's really critical that these projects align themselves with national policy objectives. We see connectivity as a tool that countries can utilize to benefit themselves as well as their neighbors. So power system connectivity can improve energy security by, for example, increasing the diversity of resources available to you, or allowing you to rely on a neighbor's resources when your own domestic resources are either unavailable or, for whatever reason, not able to deliver the amount of power that you need in a given moment. It can support economic growth. It provides an economic development opportunity. You can, for example, build generation larger than you would otherwise be able to support because you can export to your neighbors. Or alternatively, you can get access to lower cost resources across your borders and therefore make give your consumers access to lower cost power and improve their economic situation. And of course, clearly it can help with countries that are looking to meet net zero or specific renewable energy targets. But also critically, we see green power corridors as building off of existing work. So in the ASEAN context, that means we have the ASEAN power grid, which you've already heard of. There's also work more sub-regional within ASEAN, within Southeast Asia, called the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Program, led by ADB. Or there's work by others outside of this region, such as IRENA's work on clean energy corridors. We see all of these efforts as ones that provide options or opportunities to build off of. The idea here is not to provide some new vision that is conflicting with all the existing work, but to take the existing work and try to turn it into a more coherent vision that is reflective of the needs and desires of the countries in question. We are actually doing this right now in the context of Northeast Asia. We're developing a green power corridor roadmap for Northeast Asia, which is a region that does not have anything like an ASEAN power grid vision. So this really would be a first step towards creating that coherent vision. Many proposed projects, but not one that actually builds off of country goals or policy objectives. In Southeast Asia, we have a lot more to build off of. And so a green power corridor vision for this part of the world, I think, would have a great chance of success. Next slide, please. So how do we accelerate progress in Southeast Asia? Well, we've already heard a lot of great suggestions, and some of these I think I'll echo. But let me start by just saying a lot of the building blocks that are necessary for success are already in place. There is political will in this region, at least to some extent. You have heard already about the APAEC. You've heard about the Aims 3 being endorsed at last year's ASEAN ministers meeting. There is a clear desire among ASEAN member states to move forward on the ASEAN power grid. Now, that said, let me add a caveat. We are seeing certain policies being proposed that would move things in the wrong direction, at least in my personal view. Countries that are suggesting they prefer to use renewable energy resources domestically only, and only allow the export of fossil fuel-based resources, or domestically first before the export of renewable energy. That might make sense in one context of making sure that you're meeting your domestic goals, but it undermines the opportunity to leverage resources across your border to meet your own goals too. So we want to see political support move in the direction of more of collaboration and mutual benefit, and less in the direction of country level first. Moving on, there are a number of supportive institutions in this region. So you've already heard from the ASEAN Center for Energy. There's the heads of the ASEAN Power Utilities and Authorities. There's the ASEAN Energy Regulatory Network, and of course, there's ASEAN Secretariat. These institutions all play really important roles attacking various different aspects of regional power system integration. More work, though, needs to be done, and I'll come to that in a second. You've already heard about the regional grid plan, Aims 3. This is fantastic. It's a really excellent example of how countries in this region can work together, but also use their collaborative processes to show the benefits of regional integration for renewable energy integration in particular. So we need a lot more of that. We need a more regular process of this, but it's already a great start. And then there's the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia Power System Integration and Singapore Power Integration Project, which is a pilot project which transmits hydropower from Laos through Thailand to Malaysia and soon Singapore. This is the first example of a multilateral power trade in this region, and it's an excellent start for building more multilateral, multi-directional power trading. But to accelerate progress, a lot more work really needs to be done. So I mentioned the supportive institutions are in place. They need more capacity, though, to do the work necessary to build the ASEAN power grid. So we need to see more capacity within ACE, of course, who are being asked to do a lot already. We need to see more capacity among the utilities in Papua to enable more collaboration on the transmission development side and the grid code development side. We definitely need more capacity for the ASEAN Energy Regulatory Network. Regulators are really critical to this process. Not only do they make sure the rules that are developed are coherent, consistent, and relevant, they can make sure they're consistent with policy objectives at the national level, but also regional goals, but they're also the voice of the consumer. It's really important that ASEAN power grid development be supportive of and beneficial to end users. Otherwise, this is not really going to work in the long run. And of course, ASEAN Secretariat, I'm sure could use more help as well. But also, we probably need to be developing new institutions. You heard this already in Kuntwara's presentation at the beginning. Who will actually manage a regional market? Who will do the conflict resolution if there is a disagreement? Maybe it's one of the existing institutions, but perhaps you need to create a new one. To enable more cross-border infrastructure development, we saw these great plans. We can also see from the numbers we're not on track to be where we need to be to get all these lines in place. We need to see more transparency. For example, more data sharing, more sharing of planning processes, more sharing of assumptions. We need more harmonization of processes, tools used, grid codes, et cetera, to make the integration of these interconnectors more effective, more efficient, and faster. And we need to finance these interconnectors. We need more innovative tools and methods for financing, going beyond just the on-balance sheet publicly financed model to bring in more private finance, leveraging climate finance, green finance, et cetera. For those of you following along in the agenda for ACEF tomorrow, will actually be a colleague of mine, Randy Christensen, will be presenting a paper we're publishing this week, looking at involving private sector finance in interconnectors. I highly encourage you to join that session tomorrow morning. And finally, building off the LTMS, we want to develop a pilot project for full multilateral power trading in this region. It's a fantastic start, but it's unidirectional. We need to see more opportunities for trading between multiple sets of countries, and especially linked to real-time system needs. That's what it's going to take to integrate variable renewables at scale. That is it from me. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Matthew. There's some great insights there into the ESCAP roadmap and the green power corridors, but especially great to hear your thoughts and insights on the current state of play here in Southeast Asia and the opportunities that exist to build on what is quite a strong foundation and opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. Thank you very much. Also, for myself, I have quite a lot of questions actually, so I'd just like to remind our participants online that you can leave questions in the chat box, and we'll be having a roundtable discussion where you'll be able to ask Matthew and the other panelists questions at the end of this. So next, over to Michael L. Boyd, who is the Senior Energy Advisor at USAID Regional Development Mission for Asia. Dr. Michael plays a guiding role in developing and managing implementation of USAID's and IDMA's regional energy program. In particular, the recently launched 5-year $40 million USAID Southeast Asia Smart Power Program and coordinating overall USG energy sector support and links with other donors, as well as providing policy advice to key stakeholders and governments in the region. Michael has had an interesting past. From 2018 to 2020, Michael was Energy Sector Director with Tetra Tech ESI, serving as the Chief of Party for the Power Central Asia Program. And before that, on the Armenia Market Liberalization and Electricity Trade Project. It's very fascinating. Michael, it'll be great to hear from you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And first and foremost, thank you to the Energy Transition Partnership for putting together this really excellent group of people. I'm humbled to be here with everybody, having come to the region more recently, although I have a lot of experience from elsewhere, but and really on a key topic for all of us. I'll wait here till the slides come up. Thank you. And I'm just going to be talking briefly, and I am going to be very brief, about the newly launched USAID Southeast Asia Smart Power Program, and in particular focusing on our support for the ASEAN Power Grid strategic implementation. Next slide, please. The USAID in the regional context has been involved with energy support in Southeast Asia for a number of years. And so the Smart Power Program is the newest phase. As Pak Benny has mentioned, our predecessor project, the Clean Power Asia, was a key counterpart with ACE in terms of working on the AIMS-3 study. And so we're very pleased and proud to be able to follow that up as the new flagship, particularly for expanded US ASEAN support. Just a month ago in Washington, the President of the United States convened the heads of governments of ASEAN for a special summit. And amongst other things, was announcing a climate change initiative, not surprisingly. And key to that as a deliverable was our Smart Power Program as a tool to help ASEAN advance their climate change, their net zero, their objectives towards greenhouse gas emissions. So the goals and objectives of the Smart Power Program, you can see there, are directly aligned with the recently launched USAID climate change strategy that was launched in April of this year on Earth Day. And it's focused on widening deployment of advanced clean energy systems, which covers a lot of ground to support country goals and commitments to reach their greenhouse gas emission reduction targets toward net zero economies. Next slide, please. The Smart Power Program engages in work streams covering 6 tasks, and I'm not going to read through this slide, directed at 3 objectives: to expand deployment of advanced clean energy technologies, including renewable energy and energy efficiency, and to work with utilities, in particular to improve performance. And that's a key area where often when you say work with utilities, people think generation utilities, but in the context of the challenges for the ASEAN power grid, it really does also boil down to the transmission companies and the various elements of the system to help them both realize and manage expanded clean energy on the grid and contribute to a regional electricity trade. We've heard from the excellent presentations preceding me about the benefits, about the work that's been done already, and about the challenges that lie ahead for that. The key modalities that we are looking to follow are partnership and collaboration. Again, that's a key reason why I'm pleased to be here with all of these organizations represented on this panel and convened under the Energy Transition Partnership, to talk about how we can collaborate and work together as regional platforms and institutions to advance the country's goals for energy security towards their net zero commitments. Next slide, please. This one, a lot of people know, and I'm not going to run through that, but I wanted to emphasize, as has been pointed out multiple times, that the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, Phase 2, covering the period now from 2021 to 2026, the period we're in, the period that the Smart Power Program is in place for, is a key element of how we move forward on this agenda. And the ASEAN Power Grid Program Area 1 of that has specific outcomes and action plans, which are well thought out, clearly building on the work, the decades of work that Dr. Twarat and others have noted. There's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge in this region. We need to move forward from that to, as the APG says, APG 1, goal 1, accelerate the progress of the projects and initiate the expansion of the trading and work on the institutional framework and regulatory capacity that's required, and work on harmonizing the minimum technical requirements and exploring integration and the role of integrating variable renewable energy. These are all obviously topics that each of the presentations prior to mine have touched on in very important and illuminating ways, and we'll come to the discussion. I'll look forward to both listening to the questions and discussing with our counterparts the challenges that this raises. And next slide, please. Just to be very practical, Dr. Benny may recognize some of this because we have been very recently, that is to say the Smart Power Program team has been very recently in Jakarta at the ASEAN Center for Energy, talking about how do we do this? How do we get down to nuts and bolts of turning the APG outcomes into specific tasks and subtasks that Smart Power Program can contribute to, that we can support. And here are a list of things. This is not final, this is a discussion document. We've got another phase, we're going through other phases, but it clearly involves engaging, supporting ACE efforts to seek funding for primary interconnectors under the AIMS-3 study, building capacity with respect to leading practices on a variety of issues, dispute resolution and others that have been mentioned already, and working with Papua Working Group on resiliency strengthening, assessing resiliency of the potential trading utilities and developing resiliency strengthening technical assistance, a variety of very specific technical support areas where we are keen to provide our assistance in an integrated and coordinated partnership, collaborative manner, really led by ACE, as far as I'm concerned, in order to allow us all, each of us as organizations who are here, to contribute and make things move. Because what we've heard, there's been a lot of great work done, and the moment is now. And the opening plenary session of today's ACEF was very, very strong in the message urgency of making the changes. It's time that we need to move forward to realize all the investments in the grid, because they're needed to be able to put that variable renewable energy and other clean energy sources, whether it's storage, whether it's energy efficiency, into a broader context that allows for sustainable growth and, of course, access to electricity for all. There's a lot more to say, and so I'm going to let others have already said most of it, so I'm not going to try to repeat that. And I'm going to leave it to our next presenter and our discussion to bring out additional points. So thank you all, and thank you. Back over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. And as you mentioned, you'll have the opportunity to say some more. We look forward to hearing from you again. I strongly note your comments there on collaboration and the importance of such. You also drew there very well the threads that are aligning the presentations today. And I echo your sentiments of drawing on the decades of experience and build on the expertise that has gone in so far, but also what's available to build on to go forward. And I think one thing that's worth saying again is there's an urgency in getting VREs on the grid and developing interconnectors. Thank you very much, Michael. Look forward to hearing from you shortly. So now I'll go over to Dr. Pablo Javier-Koch. Dr. Pablo works as an energy analyst at the Renewables Integration and Secure Electricity Unit of the International Energy Agency, or IEA, focusing on topics of decarbonisation, power system flexibility, power market development, and renewable energy integration. He's an electrical engineer with a PhD in energy economics from the Technical University of Denmark. He has vast experience working on the development of policy for integration of renewable energy and markets. Previously, he worked at the Danish Energy Agency in Denmark, leading international government-to-government programs focusing on the global clean energy transition. It's an honor to have you here, Dr. Pablo. Please, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your introduction. I would say the honor is completely mine. It's a great pleasure to be participating in this event and sharing the floor with my fellow speakers. I want to share some of the work that we've done at the International Energy Agency and our perspectives on what is the possibilities of developing multilateral power trade to enable security, affordability, and sustainability for the ASEAN member states. If we could share next slide, please. So these three concepts, affordability, sustainability, and security, are really a core of the things that we need to do. And unfortunately, this trilemma is challenging. It's challenging to develop a system that allows us to correctly balance and move in all the dimensions of this pillar. And regional power system integration is particularly important and interesting because it's one of the tools that enables us to advance all of these pillars, all of these dimensions. It allows us to reduce costs by allowing for more efficient allocation of generation sources and therefore tapping into the lowest cost resources that we can have in the region. It allows to enhance electricity security through cross-border trading and, of course, taking advantage of a more diversified supply. It can also encourage the integration of renewables that would, in other cases, maybe not have access to load centers. For example, what Mr. Sutabudur presented during his presentation on the situation of curtailment of renewables. And it is from this perspective of utilizing multilateral power trading and regional integration of the electricity system that we've been working at the IEA since 2015 in the sector. And one of the main results of this work has been a report carried out by my colleagues, published a couple of years ago, that is precisely focused on establishing multilateral power trade in ASEAN. And this is a report that was requested by the ASEAN member states and the HAPON, the heads of the power utilities, in which we look at what are the possibilities and the possible paths that ASEAN can follow to develop multilateral power trade. This is based on international experiences, and then see what are the existing challenges, what are the existing barriers, but also what are the existing possibilities over which the region can develop its power system, and all of this aligned with the requirements and wishes of the member states, particularly with high concern regarding a non-binding, an opt-in, and a stepwise approach that will enable them to develop multilateral power trade at different times. And as of today, as we can see, and as the previous presenters have shared, like ASEAN has made significant progress on the development of the ASEAN power grid, although today we're still limited to what is the bilateral development of infrastructure and the development of bilateral trade. And what we want to look at is how international experiences can support the transition from exclusively bilateral developments towards a more regional perspective. And I'm afraid I'm repeating some of the great things that my previous speakers have said, because this development does not start from zero. And this is one of the great advantages. There are numerous initiatives in terms of infrastructure, in terms of trading that we can utilize as building blocks. For example, the AIMS-3 project itself and its relevance for the infrastructural development of the region, as well as the LTMS power integration project, which is a nascent bilateral trading format in a sub-region of the ASEAN member states, as well as the work done on, for example, harmonizing the technical work through the GMS. So if we could move to the next slide, please. As part of this study, what we look at is what can be identified as the minimum requirements for establishing multilateral power trade. And I believe that a similar figure was shared by Mr. Sutabutur on his presentation. Makes me very glad to see that our messages are being incorporated and that are supporting the institutions in the region in their work. And there's these three main dimensions, all of which are essential to being able to establish multilateral power trade in the region. And the first starting point is, of course, political. The political requirements are clear. There needs to be a political will, and this political will needs to be implemented through governmental agreements and through providing the mandate to the different institutions and member states to move in this direction. I believe that the messaging around the topic has been clear, that the time is now. There's ambitious targets for decarbonization. There's a need for expanding the utilization of our resources in the region. And from this perspective, further push from the political side will only benefit the acceleration of the development of the regional trading in Southeast Asia. On the second pillar, what we have is the technical requirements. And I believe that very typically this is the pillar that most people look into. It's the things that as energy experts, we tend to be a bit more attracted to. And that means the grid codes, the technical standards, third-party agreements. So how are we going to allow the different power system, national systems to participate and utilize regional resources? And this is extremely interesting, it's extremely important, but it's important to note that when we look at the development of multilateral power trade in the region, it is not necessary to harmonize absolutely every single grid code of the region, for example. No, that we can keep the national decisions under national grid codes as long as we manage to establish minimal levels on the sectors of the system that are actually relevant for the operation of regional trading. And that means that if we establish these minimum requirements, each country can maintain its independent status of regulations as long as they have an interface that allows them to maintain system security and to properly trade with the other countries in the region. Another interesting point is data and information sharing. I know that in previous attempts for developing data and information sharing, there's always a bit of concern regarding, well, of course, grid infrastructure can have a national security status. But once again, the data that is needed for beginning to establish multilateral power trade is not very often at this level of security. It's not necessary to share all data. It's more important to establish data sharing agreements where we can establish clearly and transparently which data will be shared publicly, which data can be shared in a limited manner, and which data will remain nationally private for whichever reasons. The final pillar, the final dimension is the institutional. And I feel that unfortunately, this pillar being equally as important as the rest tends to be glossed over in a lot of these discussions. I am very happy to see that this has not been the case in the previous presentations. It's something that every presenter has named before, because really the institutional arrangements, both from the regulatory perspective as well as from the market operation perspective, are really essential. And here, once again, as we talked about the building blocks before, it is not necessary to create a whole set of new institutions. There are several highly qualified institutions that can be leveraged, can be further developed. And in the cases where there is really no other organization or institution that exists today, we can look into creating new ones. But I think that the message here is that we really need to take advantage of the great organizations that we have, of ACE, of HAPUA, of the Energy Regulators Network, and provide them the means, the support to really develop them and enable them to provide the services according to their mandate. Next slide, please. So with that, I want to close my presentation and thank you very much for listening in. I believe that there's going to be some questions and discussion afterward, which I'm very keen to hear. So back to you, John, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Pablo. That was great. Thank you for sharing your insights and for sharing details and key takeaways of the FS on ASEAN multilateral power trade. I think you captured really well the challenges, but also the magnitude of them is not always as they seem, and the pathways to overcoming them are real and tangible, that we're not looking at the fantasy project here, that there's a very definite way forward. Yeah, the work you and your fellow colleagues are doing at the IEA is incredibly valuable, and it really can't be overstated, the importance of such. So thank you very much. So we've come to the end of our presentations. I think all in attendance would agree that so far we're having a very stimulating event. I'm certainly learning a lot and enjoying the dialogue. I think it's also a good time for me to acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Yu Chong Nam, who is the ETP regional coordinator, who's been pivotal in putting this together. So thank you, Chong, you've done a great job. So far we've heard from ACE, CASE, UNSCAP, USAID and IEA. There's been a common thread that there are challenges to achieve the level of connectivity we're searching for, but we're not starting from scratch. I think all speakers have acknowledged that great work has gone before and that there exists today a great level of expertise and, maybe more importantly, the experience to build on. We've heard the need for the integration of networks, of systems and of markets and of the benefits that this will bring. And of course, we hear the importance that sustainability and green energy needs to be at the core of this. And also, I think most importantly, we've heard that this sort of action needs to be now. I think the word urgent came up in all 5 presentations. I couldn't agree more. For now, we go to our panel discussion. So we'll have some more free-flowing conversation here. The way we'll do this is we'll group our presenters today into 2 groups and ask some questions, open-ended. So in the first group, I'd like to call on Dr. Pablo, Dr. Michael, and Matt. So if you don't mind, I'll pose a question and feel free to just raise your hand and come in with your thoughts. So these are, yeah, so what are the current key constraints and institutional gaps for expanding investment in implementing APG initiatives, such as the LTM-SPIP or the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore project, or the GMS, for the establishment of multilateral power trade in Southeast Asia? So I'll say that again. So what are the current key constraints and institutional gaps to expanding the investment in implementing APG initiatives? Would anybody like to come in on that one first? Yeah, please go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a really important question, and I'll try to keep my answer brief. I mean, I think there's, as I mentioned already, there's a capacity gap that needs to be addressed on the institutional side. I think it really is an obstacle to affecting a lot of change, and especially when it comes to the infrastructure development piece. But there's also, I think, a lack of clarity over certain responsibilities and roles that needs to be addressed as well. So, the example I always like to point to is in the EU context, you have similar institutions in the ASEAN context. You have the NSOE, which is the network of TSOs, and you have ACER, which is a regional regulatory body. And they both have really important roles to play, but most importantly, their roles are very clearly defined and the relationship is very clearly defined. So one will set a framework for rules, the other institution will develop the fleshed out versions of them, and then they'll go back for approval and et cetera, and then implementation happens at the national level. So there are checks and balances along the way to ensure that everything is consistent with national policies, and of course in the EU context, EU rules, but there is also an effective collaboration between the institutions. So I think that's really one place that there is great collaboration, I want to say, among the ASEAN institutions, but there isn't a clarity of roles and responsibilities, and there isn't a clear sense of how the regional institutions relate to national ones. So I think those relationships really need to be resolved, and maybe I'll pause at that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Please, I see your hands up, Pablo. Dr. Pablo, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, I quite agree with Matt. I believe that the aspect of developing these institutions and to establish them and the interfaces between them is going to be one of the main drivers. And when you mention, for example, expanding investments, when we think about investments, what we need to think about is transparency and long-term stability to minimize regulatory risk, and the development of solid institutions with clearly defined mandates, with clearly defined timelines and governance that enables also the changing of the rules themselves is really what's going to open the door for further financing, for affordable financing, and for the kind of stability that we need to achieve solid investments in the region. So that's my short intervention. Thank you.
And I'm not sure that I would have much to add to that in particular, because I think it's very useful to take the lens, which is one that I would like to take and intend to take over time, of the investor, and would like to see more private sector investment in transmission capacity. And I think as Matt alluded, the coming SCAP study is very, very good on emphasizing, yes, there are different models, and yes, you can stick with the model where there's essentially government financing for a lot of these investments, but the investment need, particularly for APG in the context of building out renewables and building out a net zero direction for the system is huge, and it's simply not going to be met by those sources. So the private sector has to be brought in, and again, as Paulo said, when you bring in the private sector and you bring them to a project, whether it's a transboundary project, a trading project, they need to have clear rules. They need to understand, and they don't expect that the rules will never change. The key is to have processes and have transparency so that, yes, you lay out the ground rules, everybody works according to those rules, but if something needs to be changed, then yes, it can be in an appropriate fashion. Again, this is talking about institutions that have clear mandates, whether they're technical mandates, again, coming back to Matt's observation. And I've observed a very similar process in South Asia, particularly in India, over a 20-year period of the development of the regulatory side of the interstate needs for building out the transmission system and the interregional trade, and the transmission systems and the transmission operators and their needs, and how they have separate entities. The transmission operators have to figure out how to make all of those systems fit together, but the regulators have to tell them what the ground rules are and how that structure can be built out with other objectives. So again, the ASEAN region has all of these parts. They have made a tremendous amount of progress, and so it's a question now of moving the conversation forward to say, okay, let's figure out where the gap is with respect to a particular requirement and how we can best solve that. And we don't necessarily have to solve them all at once. I can't remember, several of our presenters have pointed out, what we need to do is define cases, look at them, look for solutions that lead to generalizable outcomes, in particular, the things that are needed in the long run. We don't have to get everything perfect in the first place, but we need to move in that direction in a stepwise fashion. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So continuing in the theme of this question, how can ASEAN member states unlock more financing through the lens of considering the different levels of economic development and the different market structures? The needs of Indonesia, for example, and access to finance for Indonesia differs significantly from that of, let's say, Lao PDR. So how can they unlock this financing, and how would you recommend they go about doing this? Please, Matthew.
Yeah, no, I mean, Joe, thank you for the question. I think it's really maybe the most critical one, because one thing just to say at the start, right now it's not an absence of funding. There's not a lack of funding for projects like this. It's a perception that there's a lack of opportunity, but really there's a tremendous opportunity in the ASEAN context for grid development and for financing, and a lot of opportunities for bringing in private finance. I mentioned the paper already. That paper discussed various models of bringing private finance in, and there's basically essentially there's two broad categories that I would highlight. One is, do you want to focus on the grid as a whole? Do you kind of outsource or give that opportunity to build a grid to an institution as privately owned, or do you focus on an individual line? And one thing I would say is, I think in the case of ASEAN, individual lines is probably a good place to start. There's already tremendous opportunities among projects that are just identified in the AIMS 3 study, for example. So perhaps one of those lines could be identified as a pilot project and set aside as one where we would have some kind of an open tender and allow private sector participants to build it. Now, to your point on different countries and the diversity of needs and opportunities, it's a really critical one, because if you're going to build a line connecting a very wealthy country to one that has a lot of development needs, then you need to make sure two things. One, that line isn't imposing too much of a financial burden on the country which doesn't have the financial capacity to cover those costs. Now, this is where the financing from private sector can come in, but you need to make sure that the governments involved are sharing responsibility of development equitably. One thing to say in a European context, again, often there's a question about how to share the cost of a line that goes across the border. And often they'll simply decide to share it 50-50 because it's an easy way to fix that problem. Just say, we're going to just pay for it ourselves 50-50 and then we're done. It doesn't necessarily work in a context where one country is much wealthier than the other. So you might need to have a financing arrangement that just sort of recognizes that one country might need more support on the financial side. There's also, of course, the question of how the interconnector then connects into the domestic system. And there it becomes a question of, is there capacity to bring power in and distribute it to where it's needed? So that's a real constraint for some countries. Already in Vietnam, we see that there's a lot of solar power that's being curtailed because there isn't enough grid capacity to export it to, even within Vietnam, to where it's needed, right? Let alone across the border. So there may be a need to identify specific lines that could potentially resolve both the domestic congestion issue and enable the cross-border connectivity opportunity that might require more specific research or analysis. But I imagine there are many opportunities for exactly that. Maybe I'll pause there and let others come in if they'd like to.
I'll just add quickly a couple of very quick points because I agree with all that you have said, Matt. The short answer is one size does not fit all. This is very much a case-by-case basis that has to be analyzed. And so again, it's a good argument in favor of doing it on a line, sort of not trying to do system-wide projects, but doing specific lines that will allow the definition of the case-specific aspects, and ultimately getting whether whoever is involved, but particularly if you want to bring in private sector financing, you need to think about the structure of the vehicle and the allocation of risks and the degree of transparency, because those are the critical elements that a private investor will look for understanding. Over.
Thank you, Michael. And Pablo, I'd also like to come back. I think this might be a question well suited to yourself, but how do you see the role of data and data sharing for the development of multilateral power trade?
Hey, thanks, John. Well, I see that's extremely central. I think that's similar to other requirements that we need. It's a duality of, it's highly central, it's highly important, but it's not as terrible or as hard as we tend to think on the first-hand side. As I mentioned, we have some experiences from the development of the Greater Mekong sub-region harmonized grid codes, where there were some doubts about sharing data, etc. And as I mentioned in my presentation, regional markets require data sharing to function, but the data that they require is not really usually the kind of data that has a level of national security that will stop you from sharing. And here it's important to clarify that which kind of data you're going to need will depend on which kind of trading model, like it was presented in the first presentation by Mr. Sutaputru. There's different levels of regional integration. You have harmonized bilateral trading, a secondary trading model, or primary trading model, and each one of these models will require different amounts of data. Of course, the more integrated and complete the model for trading you have in the region, the more data you're going to need to share across the member states. But for the secondary model, which is the model in which you first trade nationally, and then over that, you trade whichever excellence or needs you have at the regional level, the kind of data that you need is not extensive. Basically, I would say that there's two main kinds of data you need. You need available transmission capacity, and you're going to need market data on demand and supply offers. And that's the kind of data that is really what you require as a minimum to make it work. And none of this data is really hard to share. Of course, that is for the short-term operation. If you're looking a bit into the longer term, there's more data that would really benefit member states from sharing when we're talking about plans for the development of the national and regional grid and those kind of longer term perspectives. Those can really enable more efficient and more successful development of multilateral power trading. But in the end, those are more nice to have than a need to have. And that means that member states of ASEAN will be able to choose how much to share and when to share it. So I think that maybe what we would need to focus on is data sharing agreements. And I think it's a recurring theme of the governance, the rules, the interfaces. We need to agree which data will be shared, by whom, to whom, when, how public will it be, and based on this, all players and all actors in the region will be able then to participate on the market, to make their plans, and to support this project to be a successful one. I'm going to cut it there, sorry.
Thank you, Pablo. I think I directed that to the right person. That's a great answer. And that also brings me to one final question before I move over to the next panel group. And also there's a lot of questions that have additionally come in the chat box. I'll try and maybe save 10 minutes at the end to open up to all the panelists. But building on the sharing and coordinating from a data perspective, but also a wider perspective, and I know how challenging this is for my job, how can a donor support, how can a development partner community and support from such for APG development be better coordinated? I think data sharing is part of this, but it goes beyond this. Would anyone like to come in and suggest how development partners could work to support APG? Michael, I saw you were muted there.
Yeah, I'll take a first cut at this one, but welcome additional thoughts and inputs. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's incredibly important that there is a regional entity that has the primary role of coordinating the donors. The donors don't coordinate themselves. Donors have their own, sometimes agendas, sometimes just their own internal dynamics and things. And so, you know, you put any of them in charge of anything and it will have an influence. But if you're talking about something that is as regional centric for the long-term growth, development, and benefit of the ASEAN member states, I would think that, you know, one of the things I would hope we will do over the next 4 or 5 years is strengthen ACE capacity to provide a clearinghouse for donor support across a broader range of issues. I know ACE is very stretched in its excellent capacity with a lot of other tasks. So I'm not talking about adding a task to them. I'm talking about bringing resources to them to try to help do that. And I think, you know, obviously we're sitting on a panel which is organized by a platform, which is all about bringing together like-minded and interested parties, whether they're governments or agencies or private sector foundations or anybody who wants to engage in a dialogue and support a process. So something like the Energy Transition Platform is partnership is a very important platform for this. I mean, I think there are several other possibilities, but I'll stop there for myself and let others chime in.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, Pablo, I'll try and come back to you again at the end. I have Pak Benny and Kuntuinya. I want to go to the second panel discussion, but I think this could go on all night if I allowed it to, but I promise you I won't. So if I thank you for your time, and I'll try and bring all 5 speakers back in at the end for some quick reflections, because this really is stimulating. So we have Pak Benny and Kuntuinya, and I think we still have Dr. Twarat with us as well. So Dr. Twarat, I'd also like to invite you into this panel discussion if you'd be willing. And hi Kuntuinya.
Hi.
Twarat and Pak Benny. Okay, so the question I have to pose to this panel discussion is ASEAN ready to move to multilateral cross-border electricity trade? That's quite simple. And what are the necessary steps to start and implement APG in the long run? So I guess the question is, are we ready? Can we start the multilateral cross-border electricity trade, and what are the next steps? And that's open. Whoever would like to answer, please go ahead.
Well, can I go first?
Please, with pleasure.
Well, I think ASEAN is ready, and we already see some. But I think the key issue is term and conditions. Right now, the easiest way is to connect it bilaterally, and the terms and condition is just from one country to another country. The next step would be about terms of condition of transit country, billing charge, and harmonize grid code, and also the institution who run the market operator, in which would become more difficult. But I think in terms of the capacity of human resources, I'm very certain that with the leadership of ACE and ASEAN Secretariat and the help from our friends from international arena, I'm pretty sure that we can move this forward. But we just need some alliance to form an axis, of organization who would like to bring APG forward quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. And I saw Pak Penny unmute there.
Yes. I'm personally, I'm not sure when we could boldly say that ASEAN is ready, but as Dr. Thorat say, ASEAN, we are ready. So we at ASEAN Center for Energy are supporting the country. So we will also go along with saying that ASEAN is ready to move to multilateral cross-border electricity trade. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the ultimate aim is to construct a regional power interconnection, beginning with the cross-border bilateral term and gradually expanding it to super-regional term. And ASEAN is moving in this direction progressively. Lao, Thailand, Malaysia power integration project is a solid example. The power purchase amount has been expanded up to 300, transferred through the existing interconnection system within Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia. Back in 2019, the energy purchase and wheeling agreement was signed to push for the phase 2 operation. And from January 2020 until December 2021, I think around 2.6 gigawatt of hours electricity has been traded. And it's a progression with the extension to Singapore now, even though there is still ongoing discussion how to move it forward, considering a number of different situations in each countries. But the power purchase amount is up to 100 megawatt through the existing interconnection system between Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, planned to COD by this year or later next year. Where the power transfer will be done on a non-intermittent 24/7 basis with a firm basis in the wait system. So then progressing on the signing on the PPA and EWA agreement in this context. And by 2025, that was mandated by the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, we expected to have another multilateral power trade in this region. That's a mandate from the minister that so we join force. I think that we are also happy to receive the support from the ETP and with the case, and also from the USA, that how we collaboratively move forward to achieve this goal, having another multilateral power trade in this region by 2025. The step-wise is being mentioned by a previous speaker many times, but the first step from my personal point of view, for us countries to say the common goals, to agree that this is the direction that we want to go together. I stop here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Benny. And I saw Trinia also raised her hand, please.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I mean, if the questions is around ASEAN's ready or not, so I follow Dr. Thorat and Benny. So I think ASEAN's, we have a clear already target on this, at least for the multilateral power trade is already put on the table of the ministry, and also with let's say, because in ASEAN, the demands of the electricity is increasing significantly in all countries. I mean, most of the country here. And then for even some Southeast Asia country, we have more stringent mitigation target, which just announced in COP26, for example, like Thailand and Indonesia. And then, but I think the clear benefits of the APG is could bring, the access to a border resource of the power resource, and potentially that resource could be somehow cheaper than build the new power plants. And also the APG can allow the trade between the excess and surplus electricity between countries. And I think talking about the clear targets of ASEAN and the clear benefits of APG, it seems to be that the multilateral power trade could be something which ready and will likely to happen. And from ASEAN, we already have, they already have a very comprehensive study on the AIMS-3 phase 1 and phase 2. In last 2 years, which already identified clearly about the renewable resource additional for the solar and wind, and also the transmissions analysis, right, to support this multilateral power trade. So I also consider that's one of the readiness step of ASEAN. But maybe just what is the necessary step? Maybe got into, okay, then we are knowing that the willings to have the ASEAN, the APG is all set, but maybe now have to be focusing on the first one. Maybe the regional framework should be framed in the respective of, around the national concern, because currently, like each country, they have national concern around energy, like power system security, diversity, affordability, for example. And I think the regional framework that ASEAN will have should be framed around the national concern and also the benefits of the regional framework as well. And yeah, this needs something, the agreements around the policymaker and some degree of the regional plannings and agreements together with the ASEAN member states. So yeah, I'll stop from here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, building on from that, I'd like to inquire, and it'd be wrong of me not to, given that I'm from Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, what is the role of the APG in supporting ASEAN to achieve its energy transition ambition and increase renewable penetration? How is this being prioritized in the APG, and what role does it foresee itself taking?
If I may start first,
Please.
like maybe, yeah, the countries in this region right now is re-emphasizing its vision for the energy transition ambition and to increase renewable energy penetration. But having more renewable energy is not an easy task for that countries as individually. So this is where we build the discussion, dialogue and cooperation among the ASEAN countries, particularly through the ASEAN Power Grid, on how to optimize the indigenous resource to the region to support this vision. Singapore is one of example, a good example. I mean, as we know that the Singapore is having a challenge with its geographical situation to raise its ambition on the energy transition or having more renewable energy. Then tapping to the potential of the ASEAN Power Grid through the currently the ongoing discussion on the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power interconnection projects to bringing the renewable energy from the Laos to supply the demand in the region, or through the discussion that they have the Indonesian counterpart to also bring the green energy to fulfill the demand in the Singapore is a concrete example that why the ASEAN power grid is very important for the ASEAN to move the energy transition. And as mentioned earlier, that ASEAN aspiration is to have the 23% of renewable energy by the energy mix in 2025. And from our studies that we conducted, it will be, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult for us, for the region to achieve that target individually. That's going to be, but if we collectively work that through this sharing resource through the ASEAN power grid, this is something that can be achieved in the short-term period with economic cost, which is very much lower. That's why that the ASEAN leaders see the APG is very important, and then now is trying to collectively move within the 10 countries, and also with the support from the partners, the ETP, USA, the IEA, and other institutions to set up the proper frameworks to escalate the progress. I stop here. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Pak Benny.
John, may I? I just would like to echo what Benny just mentioned, that I think he's right on the dot, that ASEAN has to work on the collective basis. We have to work collectively, because I don't think any one single ASEAN member country could take the journey of becoming net zero or carbon neutral on its own. We need one another. I just give one example. Okay, just only Thailand and Laos. If without the Thai markets, the endowments of renewable energy resources, such as the hydropower potential in Laos, would not be that attractive. But with the market forces and connectivity to the Thai market, it brings the potential, it brings demands to the supply and make that supply more valuable. And also vice versa, Thailand cannot go alone. We don't have enough resources to become carbon neutral or a net zero country. So I guess what Benny mentioned is right on the dot, that ASEAN as a whole, 10 member country, I don't think any single country can go alone on this energy transition journey. We have to go together, and we have to go in such a harmonized way, in a way that we probably, behind the scene there's some give and take, but we could move forward. And we have to, pick up the pace, because the COVID stuff already delayed many activity for the past 2 years. So we have many activity that we have to make it up and pick up the pace from now on. That's my take, John.
Thank you very much.
Should I?
I see you ready, please. Go ahead.
Yes, so very quick intervention from my side. I think the APG can provide kind of the flexibility to the power system. For example, so we are now kind of maybe aware about some situations in some country, for example, Vietnam. So because they install the solar and quite significantly, rapidly, and then that sometimes lead to the curtailments. And I think with the APG, it's also increased the flexibility. For example, that curtailment can be traced to neighboring country. And that's also can increase the overall, like the renewable energy penetrations, not only in Vietnam, but also in the neighboring country. So that's also fit the concept with, like in ASEAN, like help each other to achieve the lower carbons target together. And yeah, I stop from that. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, according to the schedule, there's a 5-minute wrap up and summary for myself, but I think that would be an injustice to our speakers. I'd like to just keep this going until the end, and I'll finish abruptly if that's okay, rather than have a conclusion. I'm trying to summarize the questions from the panel, from the audience. So I invite the other speakers to also turn their cameras on if they'd like to answer. And I'll ask some shorter, quite specific questions, although I'm not sure how short that will be. But so the first one, does ASEAN have a plan to utilize green hydrogen to increase its energy security? Would anyone like to come in and talk about the role of green hydrogen in APG? Might be in a can of worms here, but please. Okay, Matthew.
So I can't speak to ASEAN in particular, so forgive me if I'm not answering the question directly. I can say that we are doing a lot more work in the SCAP side to understand the potential role for hydrogen in the energy system. I think it's very clear that while electrification of end uses is going to take us a very long way towards decarbonization, it's not going to get us to 100%, and hydrogen has a very strong role to play, not least because many countries in this region are really bullish on it and doing a lot to develop their own hydrogen resources. You know, just next door, Australia has a very ambitious set of projects to develop hydrogen for export. ASEAN is quite close and could potentially benefit from that. So I think there is a potential, especially for heating, industrial uses, etc. But I think it remains to be seen how much a role will play in more edge uses like transport, for example. So maybe I'll pause at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There's no more comments on hydrogen. Next one, then, next quick question is there a potential for companies in ASEAN to trade international renewable energy certificates, IREX, once APG is officially established? If you're nodding heads here. You want to come in on the thoughts on IREX?
I would just add, excuse me, Dr. Twarat, I'll just, because what I'm going to say, I'm sure you can
sorry, Michael.
add to. I would just say that, you know, this is one of those institutional establishment questions that the answer would be definitely yes, if all of the requirements for the trading platform were established, and probably at this stage they're not, but please correct me or add, Dr. Twarat.
Yes, Michael, I would like to amplify your point. I think if we have APG as an infrastructure, I think we can trade carbon credit in many formats. It doesn't have to be IREG. It can be the European format, the Japanese format, or even the ASEAN format on our own. So I'm not quite sure about the questions, but if the questions is about trading carbons, I do believe APG is a critical fundamental of having infrastructure in place, and then we'll support the carbon credit trading in the future. But IREG is very European type, I would say. So in the future, with APG, I think that the platform can be open, not just only IREG. That's my personal opinion, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. And the final question, we have 2 minutes. We have an inquiry about AIMS-3, asking current status, when it'll be completed, and how, in particular, this may wait too long to answer, how different will the prioritized interconnection routes be from the previous study? Let's go for 1 minute answer on AIMS-3.
Yeah, so the AIMS-3 studies, I mean, phase 1, phase 2 that identified the needed infrastructure on the interconnection among the countries is complete. It's going to be to document the rest executive summary version is available. Feel free to reach me if anyone would like to have that kind of access. Unfortunately, the full document is only circulated among the policymakers, as it's contained quite a lot of confidential information. But happy to have a follow-up discussion with anyone who would like to understand more about the AIMS-3 studies. As now we are also discussing with the countries how to move forward to further exercise that how we can bring the studies into the reality of the project and transformation among the countries As mentioned or showing earlier, there is a number of lists on interconnection projects that been identified, whether expanding from the existing interconnection or proposing the new interconnection project. So discussion happening on the bilateral basis or 2-3 country basis that involve on that, but very much welcome the involvement, the support, the interest, including with the private sector, the financing institution that help and move forward into reality. Welcome if anyone have a follow-up discussion after this.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the event. Chong, can I suggest you take a quick photo, or maybe turn your own camera on, Chong? You've been as much of this part of this event as everybody else, acknowledging your great support once again. So maybe everybody smile as we get a group photo. And I'd like to wholeheartedly thank everybody for taking part. Look forward to seeing you in the very near future and working together on these projects. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you all soon. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chong. Thank you. Good night, all. Thank you, all the participants online. It's been a very eventful evening.
Thank you.